Hello again from the Philippines. The title of this video talk or video essay, however you wish to call it, is 100 Years of Finland's Independence. On December the 6th, 1917, the Finnish Parliament, which had a narrow non-socialist majority, approved the so-called Independence Senate's proposal for the declaration of Finnish independence. The Senate or cabinet or government was led by Mr. Per Eivind Svinhufvud, and it contained only liberal and conservative politicians. The Social Democrats, who still were by far the largest party in the Finnish parliament, having received 92 deputies in the October 1917 Finnish parliamentary election, were excluded from the government, and actually most of them wanted to be outside the government because they believed that Finland should consult with the new Bolshevik or communist regime in Russia, led by Mr. Vladimir Lenin, who incidentally had arrived back to Russia from exile in Switzerland by traveling through some European countries, including Finland, by train. But since the non-socialists had that majority, they prevailed. And the declaration stated that Finland could only fulfill its duty among the nations of the world through a full independence. That is, by becoming a fully independent state, more specifically an independent republic. This despite the fact that there were some or even several monarchists in the Finnish government, including Prime Minister Svinhufvud himself. Tensions had started to grow in Finland during the First World War because of a gradually proceeding and worsening shortage of food and drink, and especially since the orders to the Finnish weapon factories had virtually ended following the bourgeois revolution in Russia in March 1917. So many Finns, probably most, were worried about how to make ends meet and how to remain secure. During 1917, both the conservatives and liberals on the one hand, and the socialists and communists on the other hand, had started to form informal militias to replace the largely discredited police force and armed forces. The conservative and liberal militias were called the White Guards, while the socialist and communist forces were called the Red Guards. The latter informal militias had already been formed for the first time in 1905 during the so-called general strike that had forced, together with protests in Russia's inner regions, the Tsar or Emperor Nicholas II to suspend temporarily his moves to Russify Finland, in other words, basically take away its autonomy or self-government. During January 1918, the tensions grew. The disagreement was over the direction which the independent Finland would then take. Generally speaking, the conservatives and liberals wanted Finland to first secure its independence and then to start dealing with its social problems, including the huge gap between the rich and the poor, the shortage of even basic foodstuffs like bread and butter, and then the distrust that many workers felt compared to the employers, who were clearly better off, and then the problem of tenant farmers and other people in the Finnish countryside who did not own, at least not fully, the lands that they farmed. The socialists and communists, especially the left-wing elements of Social Democrats and then the communists, wanted Finland not just to become an independent country, but to radically and quickly and even violently resolve its social problems through a so-called dictatorship and revolution of the proletariat, or people. On January the 28th, 1918, the Finnish Civil War broke out. It involved various battles and atrocities on both sides. During its early part, the Reds, or left-wing socialists and communists, were able to conquer southern and southeastern Finland, while the Whites consolidated their hold on the rest of Finland. Soldiers, mainly from three countries, namely the Soviet Russia, Sweden and Germany, interfered with the Finnish Civil War. The war itself has variously been called the Civil War, or Inner War, literally translated sisällissota, Civic War, kansalaissota, Freedom War, or vapaussota, Brothers War, veljessota, Class War, especially among the Finnish communists, and then just neutrally, the War of 1918. It was, to varying extents, all of these wars. It was an inner war, or inward war, in the sense that battles took place inside one country, Finland. It was a civic war in the sense that most of the combatants were citizens of the same country, Finland. It was a freedom war or liberation war in the sense that the victory of the Whites guaranteed and hastened the practical implementation of the Finnish independence and its recognition. Because if the Reds had won, then likely Finland would have elected to join the fledgling Soviet Union, as was Mr. Lenin's wish, and that of various other Bolshevik or Soviet communist leaders. It was, to a limited extent, a class war in the sense that most rich Finns, if they had an opinion at all on the Finnish Civil War, definitely sided with the Whites, already because they were afraid of losing their property and possibly even their lives, at least their personal freedom. It was a brothers' war in the sense that it divided many families and extended families in Finland, especially in those regions or provinces where many battles were fought. Anyway, to make a long story short, in late March 1918, following the Reds' frustrated attempts to gain control of the train stop of Haapamäki in the town of Keuruu in central Finland, in order to cut off the main rail link between the Whites of southern Ostrobothnia in western Finland and of Karelia in eastern and southeastern Finland. The Whites were able to surround the city of Tampere in western Finland, and then through various bloody battles, literally bloody battles, where many people on both sides lost their lives or were injured, Tampere was conquered during the first week of April 1918. During the second week, a force of Germans led by, I think, General von der Goltz landed in Hanko, Finland's southernmost city. They proceeded quickly to conquer Helsinki from the Reds. And virtually the resistance of the Reds was brought to a halt around the city of Lahti in southern Finland during the first week of May 1918, when tens of thousands, or at least thousands of Reds were forced to surrender. There were at most something like 80,000 red prisoners, of whom thousands died because of unsanitary conditions and hunger or shortage of food in the prison camps, and unfortunately some were executed under extra legal conditions. Most of the red leadership was able to escape to the Soviet Russia, including the so-called dictator of Red Finland, or Finnish People's Republic, Mr. Kullervo Manner, and then the designer of the Finnish Red, or Socialist and Communist Constitution, Mr. Otto Ville Kuusinen, who would for decades be the leading communist Finn in the Soviet Union until his death in 1964. Finland was, after the Civil War officially came to an end on May the 16th, 1918, through a victorious procession of thousands of white soldiers through Helsinki, in honor of which, or in honor of whom, General and later Marshal and President Mannerheim's equestrian or riding statue is still located in the center of Helsinki. Finland still suffered from severe food shortages, and the wounds, both physical and especially emotional wounds, of the Civil War, where some 37,000 Finns, or slightly over 1% of the population at the time, according to the Finnish War Deaths Project, lost their lives. They really anguished hundreds of thousands of people at least. Finland was a very poor country. The state funds were almost empty, and the Finns needed and wanted peace and quiet and harmonious development. In August 1918, the Rump Parliament of Finland, where there was for most time just one Social Democratic deputy, decided by its monarchist majority to declare that since the ruling dynasty had failed, in fact the Romanov dynasty had been deposed in Russia in March 1917, then Finland should choose a new king. And by October 1918 they decided to choose Mr. Friedrich Karl, or Frederick Charles, the Prince of the German state of Hessen, or Hesse, as the Finnish king. Friedrich Karl had somewhat liberal and democratic sympathies, although the designed Finnish constitution would have given the king a very strong power, even in domestic wars. However, since Germany lost the First World War and the armistice was declared under pressure from the Entente powers, the United States, Britain, and France mostly, in November 1918, Mr. Friedrich Karl realized that Finland would have great difficulties if it had him as its king, because after all, Germany not only had lost the First World War, but was widely regarded as the chief culprit of that war. Therefore, he renounced the Finnish throne in December 1918, never having set foot in Finland. Later in the same month, the regent, or temporary head of state, Mr. Svinhufvud, resigned in favor of General Mannerheim, and then under his temporary rule, the Finnish parliamentary elections were held in March 1919, in which the parties in favor of the Republic, such as the Social Democrats, Agrarians, and Progressives, gained about 3/4 majority in parliament. After this, it was clear that Finland would become a democratic republic if the rules of democracy and rule of law and peaceful political transition were followed. After lengthy debates, especially on the degree of powers that the Finnish head of state, the president, should have, finally the Finnish parliament voted by the required 5/6 majority to pass a republican constitution. In June 1919, it gave the president notably great powers, including the right to be re-elected an unlimited number of times, the right to lead Finland's foreign policy, the right to appoint and at least theoretically to even dismiss the cabinet, the right to appoint all the highest officials of the Finnish state, courts, the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Finnish Orthodox Church, the Finnish universities and the Finnish colleges, the right to issue pardons, the right to make his decisions on the government's proposed legislations independently, which included the right even to block such legislative proposals from reaching the parliament, or to choose to amend or change them as he wished, the right to dissolve the Finnish parliament without having to negotiate with any other politician and without having to give a single official reason for that, and the right to issue pardons in cases where criminals or people have been convicted of criminal acts. After a few weeks of delay, or some weeks of delay, General Mannerheim decided to ratify the constitution in July 1919, and about 1 week later, Professor K.J. or Karlo Juho Stolberg, who was the president or chairman of the Supreme Administrative Court and who had been responsible for large parts of the Finnish constitution, was chosen president by a special exception to the rule of electoral college presidential elections. Since his progressive party, the Social Democrats and centrists or agrarians supported him, he received 143 votes compared to Mannerheim's 50 votes, which came exclusively from the then right-wing National Coalitioners and Swedish People's Party, both of which were dominated by monarchist elements. Especially the first 2 decades of Finnish independence were characterized by frequently changing governments. Already 1 year, and anything above 1 year, was considered a fairly long period of rule for the Finnish cabinets. One reason was that many of those cabinets were minority cabinets, because not even all bourgeois or conservative and centrist parties or liberal parties could agree to serve in the same government, and the Social Democrats were excluded, or for a long time actually excluded themselves for ideological reasons from the government. One exception was the minority Social Democratic government of Prime Minister Väinö Tanner from 1926 to 1927. In 1937 this changed, since under the rule of Prime Minister or President Kyösti Kallio, who had long led the Agrarian Union, the Social Democrats were finally accepted into the government, and they formed the so-called Red Soil government with the agrarians and the progressives. And these so-called Red Soil governments, based on the cooperation of Social Democrats and agrarians, later centrists, would become Finland's most common form of government until 1987. The Finnish society was strongly agrarian. Around 1920, still about 5/6 of Finland's people lived in the rural towns. Now the proportion is only about 1/5 or 20% by contrast. And even at the outbreak of the Winter War in November 1939, about 3/4 of Finns lived in the rural towns. Not only did most Finns live in the rural towns, but the agrarian and rural life was idealized in many school lessons, in many books and films, and even by a significant number of Finnish Lutheran priests. Finland exercised until the 1950s a strong censorship over materials that were considered blasphemous, that is, mocking God, or sexually immoral or otherwise inappropriate. Especially the written and printed materials issued to children and teenagers were heavily censored regarding real or alleged blasphemy, foul language, especially swear words, an open depiction of sex, pornography, and of course incitement to rebel against parents and teachers, and so forth. The adult content, films, books, newspapers, and magazines were less heavily censored. And even if the books did not contain materials that were considered either blasphemous or sexually immoral, they still could be shunned by the mainstream bourgeois publishing companies. One such novel was The Witch Circle, or Noitaympyrä, that was originally written in 1931 by the left-wing writer Mr. Pentti Haanpää, which talked about a poor and unemployed Finnish man who tried his best to find a new job in Finland and eventually was forced to cross the eastern border into the Soviet Union. Already in 1928, Mr. Haanpää had ruffled feathers of especially conservative Finnish publishers and book readers by submitting his manuscript The Field and the Barrack, Kenttään ja kasarmi in Finnish, about his rather unflattering military service. Even the liberal and cosmopolitan-minded Mr. Mika Valtari tried to calm down the conservative bourgeois readership by publishing a counterpoint, where men are made, siellä missä miehiä tehdään, in 1931. That was accepted by most conservative and liberal readers. So these values, religion, home, meaning two-parent families and permanently faithful lifelong marriages, and the parents' duty to raise their children and, if necessary, to correct them, physically even, and the children's duty to obey their parents, fatherland, patriotism, and ruralism or agrarianism. Those values were generally accepted by most Finns until the 1950s or 1960s. A great majority of the Finns, including those who belonged to or voted for the Social Democratic and Communist parties, belonged to the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church. Something like 98% even at the time of the Second World War. Now, by contrast, only about 70% or slightly above that figure belonged to the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church. There was a so-called carriers or bearers of fire movement of various young Finnish writers and other artists who favored a more cosmopolitan, liberal, tolerant, progressive, and modernistic attitude towards life and culture. Especially they were fascinated with what was happening in Western and Central Europe. They included, for example, Mr. Olavi Paavolainen, Mr. Uno Kailas, who was mostly a poet, Mr. Mika Valtari, Ms. Patri Vala, and other similar artists. In 1929, the long-time simmering conflicts between the Finnish communists, especially their radical activists, and Finnish conservatives came to a head in the Western Finnish city of Lapua, where communist young people organized meetings and agitations in the local workers' house, and then they designed and performed a mocking cabaret where they mocked God, the Lutheran Church, the bourgeois fatherland, the Finnish army, and General Mannerheim. The mocking of Mannerheim was the last straw for various local conservatives who, led by farmer Vihtori Kosola, stormed the meeting and violently broke it up, beating up those communist young people and even tearing red shirts off them. The Lapua movement spread through most of Finland, although its power base was in the Western Finnish province of Southern Ostrobothnia. In 1930, it was involved in breaking up one left-wing printing press, in physically assaulting various left-wing politicians, and in forcibly transporting some of them to eastern Finland or even close to the Finnish eastern border. 3 such left-wingers were murdered. In July 1930, the agrarian minority government of Prime Minister Kyösti Kallio resigned to be replaced by a centre-right government of Per-Emil Svinhufvud, who had come back from political retirement. Since the parliament rejected an extraordinary amendment to the constitution that banned the Finnish Communist Party and its related political organizations, President Lauri Christian Relander, himself an agrarian, dissolved parliament and called fresh parliamentary elections for October 1930. In them, the right-wing and centrist parties gained exactly 2/3 of the seats and were able to pass the anti-communist laws already in November. In February 1931, Svinhufvud was very narrowly elected president over former President Ståhlberg, who had voluntarily retired in 1925. Svinhufvud proceeded to name another centre-right government. In late February and early March 1932, there was a far-right coup attempt by the activists of Lapua movement in the town of Mäntsälä to the northeast of Helsinki, but it failed, largely because so many men who would have been willing to even overthrow the government were discouraged from doing so by President Svinhufvud's strongly worded radio speech. Svinhufvud blocked the Social Democrats from entering the government even after their victory in the July 1936 parliamentary elections, which then prompted the Social Democrats to support Mr. Kallio in the February 1937 presidential elections, which Kallio won. And after taking office in March 1937, he proceeded to appoint the first center-left or red soil government. Finland had many famous athletes during its first 2 decades of independence, especially long-distance runners like Mr. Paavo Nurmi, who won a total of 9 gold medals in the Summer Olympics, and his rival Mr. Ville Ritola, who for decades lived in the United States but decided to represent Finland in the 1924-1928 Summer Olympics. and then Mr. Claes Thunberg, who was a famous and successful Finnish speed skater, and a number of cross-country skiers and so forth. Jean Sibelius continued to be revered in Finland and abroad as a representative of the Finnish nationalism, patriotism, and national romanticism in his 7 completed and published symphonies and various other songs, such as the Finlandia hymn, which is Finland's unofficial national anthem. Mr. Väinö Aaltonen designed various sculptures that emphasized the Finnish patriotism, nationalism, and even to some extent modernism. On the eve of the Winter War, Finland had about 3.7 or 3.8 million people. Helsinki was the largest city with over 200,000 or over 300,000 inhabitants. Finland had adopted the so-called Scandinavian orientation in its foreign policy in 1935. It was based on neutrality and on close cooperation with the League of Nations. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union was not convinced by Finland's profession of wanting to have peaceful relations with the other countries, including the Soviet Union. In October and early November 1939, a small Finnish delegation led by Ambassador to Sweden and Councillor of State Mr. Juho Kusti Paasikivi unsuccessfully negotiated with the Soviet leaders in Moscow over the concession of some border areas to the Soviet Union, including the leasing of the city of Hanko with its surrounding areas on Finland's southern coast. Most Finnish politicians, including President Kallio and Foreign Minister Elias Erkko, were opposed to these concessions as excessive, and therefore the negotiations broke down in early November 1939. The Soviet state-controlled media, especially radio and newspapers, unleashed a barrage of anti-Finnish propaganda to incite the Soviet army to invade Finland, which the Soviet army did on November the 30th, 1939, 4 days after a clumsily executed provocation in the village of Mainila on the Finnish-Soviet border, although on the Soviet side, where allegedly 4 Soviet soldiers had been killed. In fact, none had been killed, but some Soviet cannons fired on Mainila to make the appearance that supposedly the Finnish army had fired those shots. During the 3.5 months of Winter War, until March the 13th, 1940, Finland received a lot of sympathy from many other countries of the world. There were relief organizations founded, for example, in the United States and Sweden, and a total of over 12,000 volunteer soldiers managed to arrive to Finland before the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland lost over 20,000 soldiers as killed and vanished. According to one estimate, the Soviet Union lost over 120,000 soldiers as killed and vanished. Finland was forced to surrender to the Soviet Union most of the historical province of Karelia, the entire Hankoniemi Cape, the outer eastern islands of the Gulf of Finland, then most of the Salla-Kuusamo, or much of the Salla-Kuusamo region in northeastern Finland, and then in the Petsamo region on the Arctic coast, also a slight territory had to be surrendered to the Soviet Union. During the so-called interim peace, Finns tried to rebuild their damaged country and economy, and then to conduct a careful foreign policy towards the Soviet Union. At this time, Germany started to make diplomatic overtures and military overtures to Finland, promising that should it go to war against the Soviet Union, Finland could count on German support. And there was an informal military alliance, the so-called Brotherhood in Arms, between the two countries. This did not mean, however, that most Finnish politicians would have approved of the brutal dictatorship of Nazi Germany, including its imprisonment of political opponents and of the Jewish minority. In June 1941, Finland declared war on the Soviet Union, and most of its armed forces then attacked the newly lost territories in July 1941. They were able to conquer by the start of September or the end of August all the lost territories in Karelia, and then even cross into the Soviet territory proper. Finally, the invasion was halted in December 1941. By that time, Britain had declared war on Finland because of its military alliance with the Soviet Union. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had actually written a confidential letter to Marshal Mannerheim urging him to persuade the Finnish political leaders to stop fighting, so that Finland would not be judged with the other war culprits. Marshal Mannerheim thanked politely Prime Minister Churchill for his letter and assured Churchill that Finland would stop its invasion after reaching the positions that would be necessary for Finland in a military and strategic sense. In June 1944, the Soviet armies stationed around the Leningrad area or St. Petersburg area began a great invasion to conquer back not just the Finnish Karelia but even all of Finland. They managed to push the Finns close to the eastern border of today. However, the Finnish army did manage to avert total collapse. Many Finnish Christians then and afterwards believed that this was God's gracious act to save Finland, to spare it from virtual slavery under the Soviet rule, which unfortunately was the fate of Finland's southern neighbor Estonia, for example. In August 1944, President Risto Ryti resigned and was replaced by a special law of parliament by War Marshal Mannerheim, under the reason that it would be beneficial in the concluding stages of the war for the Finnish state and army to be led by the same person. Following the outbreak of the Winter War, almost 5 years earlier, War Marshal or Field Marshal Mannerheim had become the commander-in-chief of the Finnish army, and he continued to have that position until 1946 or 1947. During his brief presidency, which ended in March 1946 by resignation, Finland was able to conclude another peace treaty with the Soviet Union, which included a clause that obliged Finland to make heavy war reparations, mostly in the form of metal products, to the Soviet Union, originally during the next 6 years, but then it was graciously extended until 1952. The products were to be priced according to the 1938 prices, so virtually they amounted to 600 million United States dollars of that time, multiple times, of course, in the 2017 US dollars, which are inflated. In March 1946, Mr. Paasikivi replaced General or Marshal Mannerheim as the Finnish president. The new government was headed by a former Social Democrat, Mr. Mauno Pekkala, who had chosen to join the Finnish People's Democratic League, a communist-dominated political formation to the left of the Social Democrats. In 1948, however, the Communists and People's Democrats were booted out of the government after their electoral defeat and allegations of military coup plans, which, however, probably were nothing more than rumors, since the Soviet Union had refused to support any communist attempt to seize power. In the same spring, Finland and the Soviet Union had concluded the Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance Treaty that would be in force until 1992, when it was replaced by the Finnish-Russian Friendship Treaty. Under this treaty, Finland and the Soviet Union would have a close friendship. Finland would, however, remain an officially independent and democratic and Western country, but there would be that favorable trade with the Soviet Union, and the Finnish political leaders would refrain usually from openly criticizing the Soviet Union, even its invasion of other countries and its suppression of most of its citizens' human rights. In 1952, a young Finnish lady, Miss Armi Kuusala, was chosen as Miss Universe, and Finland also received favorable publicity through the Helsinki Summer Olympics. In 1955, Finland was allowed to join both the United Nations and the Council of Nordic Countries, which comprises then the 5 independent countries of the Nordic region in Northern Europe: Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. President Paasikivi retired in 1956 and was succeeded by Mr. Urho Kekkonen, who would serve as president officially until severe illnesses forced him to retire in 1982. During his time, Finland became a fully industrialized and outwardly wealthy country. The Finnish social programs expanded a lot. Many new schools, including some or several universities and colleges, were founded, and the gap between the rich and the poor clearly was reduced. On the other hand, the taxes and cost of living also rose. During Kekkonen's time, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, Finland also experienced a radical wave of liberalization in social, sexual, political, religious, and other and also educational and familial attitudes. The old values, home, religion, fatherland, and agrarianism or ruralism, were criticized and even mocked a lot in the mainstream Finnish media. A number of books where God was openly blasphemed against, and there was explicit description of sexual acts, and many gross swear words were published. One such writer, Mr. Hannu Salama, even had to go through a trial from 1965 to 1966, and he was charged with having deliberately blasphemed against God in his novel Midsummer Days Dances, Juhannustanssit, and he was given a 3-month suspended sentence without having to go to prison. However, President Kekkonen pardoned him in 1968. Television became a popular Finnish medium already in the 1960s, while radio was still regularly listened to. And as the Finnish standard of living clearly rose in the 1960s and 1970s, traveling to other countries and other continents by airplane became much more common than it had been before. English started to replace German as the favorite foreign language in Finland because Swedish is regarded as the second official language, second domestic language. Starting already in the late 1960s, around the same time, the old Finnish school system of primary schools and then two tracks of secondary schools and so-called citizens or civic schools was replaced by a 9-year compulsory but free, that is taxpayer funded but free for the students, comprehensive or grade school. It was started in Lapland around 1968 and it finally reached the Helsinki region or Helsinki itself in 1977. And this system is still in use. There have been attempts to make grade 10 compulsory, but I'm not sure if they have succeeded. President Kekkonen exercised a vigorous leadership at home and abroad. At home, he forced some governments either actively or passively to resign by withholding his support from them. 3 times he dissolved parliament and organized early parliamentary elections. Abroad, he was respected, at least officially, by many other political leaders, and as a sign of that respect, in 1975 he was able to gather the heads of state or of government of almost all European countries, including the Soviet Union and even of the United States and Canada, to sign the protocols of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Even some of his fierce critics, like the National Coalitioner Member of Parliament, Mr. Ture Junnila, admitted that this Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe would bring a constant positive advertisement value to Finland. Kekkonen's health gradually started to fail in the early 1970s due to the onset of steadily, albeit slowly, proceeding arteriosclerosis. He had to go on sick leave in September 1981. He then filed his resignation letter, or signed it, in October 1981, and formally his presidency ended in January 1982. The recently deceased Prime Minister Mauno Koivisto was elected to succeed Kekkonen. He had a clearly contrasting political style of low profile and modesty. He also was willing to persuade the Finnish Parliament to pass constitutional reforms which would limit the Finnish presidential power. And indeed, already in 1987 there were minor reductions. In 1991, bigger ones, which, for example, took away from the president the right or theoretical right to dismiss governments or individual cabinet ministers without either their own request for dismissal or the parliament's vote of no confidence. It also reduced the president's power to dissolve parliament and made him or her follow the prime minister's advice in that case. It also limited the Finnish presidential terms to 2 consecutive ones, so to a maximum of 12 years. In the early 1980s and already partly in the late 1970s, there had been a so-called hunt of sleaze merchants or corrupt top politicians, truly or allegedly corrupt top politicians, civil servants, and business leaders. A number of them were questioned, some were even arrested and tried and sentenced to some years in prison. However, overall, this sleaze merchant hunt probably did not produce very many positive results. Quite many people affected saw it as an attempt by the dwindling Finnish Rural Party, which had for a long time been led by Mr. Veikko Vennamo, to gain more followers. Anyway, in 1983, the Finnish ruralists who had been blocked from the government during the long presidency of Urho Kekkonen were allowed into the government to join the Social Democrats, centrists, and Swedish People's Party. They would serve in the government until 1990, although they did not achieve much. They had only 2 ministers in the fourth government of Prime Minister Kalevi Sorsa and 1 minister in the government of Harri Holkeri. In 1987, the National Coalitioners were able to return to the government after an absence of 21 years, and since then they have been in the government almost constantly. They only were in opposition from 2003 to 2007. The Finnish centrists, by contrast, were in opposition from 1987 to 1995, and again from 2011 to 2015, if I remember correctly. The Finnish Social Democrats had to be in the opposition from 1991 to 1995, and have been in the opposition again from 2015, if my memory serves me correctly. Feminism has been popular in Finland since the 1960s. Officially, the husbands and wives have been legally equal in marriage since the late 1920s, and since the late 1980s or early 1990s, divorce laws have become notably lenient. No specific reason for the filing of divorce is needed anymore, and in the fastest scenario, a divorce can be granted by a local court already in 6 months. The slower scenario is that the 2 spouses provenly have lived apart with the intention of getting divorced for 2 years. The Finnish birth rate started to radically drop in the 1960s, and in 2016, for the first time since the Second World War, there were less recorded live births than deaths in Finland. However, in 2016, a record 35,000 people moved to Finland. Finland, like various other European countries, has been affected by the Syrian or Middle Eastern refugee crisis since the summer of 2015, and tens of thousands of refugees have indeed moved to Finland, although thousands of them have either been deported or have voluntarily left Finland since then. This has incited a so-called Finland First movement led by a group of Finnish nationalists. According to its critics, the movement incorporates too many racists and xenophobes. According to its defenders, it simply wants to keep Finland sufficiently Finnish ethnically and culturally. The National Conservative True Finns have been in the Finnish government since 2015 in coalition with the centrists and national coalitioners. The current Prime Minister is Mr. Juha Sipilä. The current President, Mr. Sauli Niinistö, was elected as the National Coalitioner candidate in 2012. In late May 2017, he announced that he will seek a new term, however, officially as an independent candidate led by a 20,000-member electoral association of eligible Finnish voters. Finland has become, since the early 1990s, clearly more a country of immigrants, but even nowadays, no more than maybe 5, 6, or 7% of Finland's inhabitants are foreign-born, definitely less than 10%. So to argue that Finland is no longer dominated by the Finns, that it is supposedly dominated by the immigrants and refugees, is to distort the truth. Finland is now a more international country than ever before. Many Finns, especially those who are, let's say, under 50 or under 40 years old, can communicate at a sufficient level, at least in English and possibly some other foreign language, such as French, German, or in some cases Spanish. There are a number of Finns who still have at least a passive knowledge of Swedish, but especially younger Finns and more internationally minded Finns do not seem to care too much about the language. They want to learn more exotic and more widely used foreign languages. On the other hand, a group of Finnish patriots and nationalists also discourage the study of Swedish language as being unnecessary, and some even think that it is a remnant of the 300 to 600 years when, depending on which part of Finland you were living in, Sweden officially ruled Finland. A number of Finnish artists, including soprano singer Mrs. Karita Mattila, and then writer Mrs. Sofi Oksanen, and designers like Ms. Paula Suhonen and Mr. Harri Koskinen, and orchestra director Mr. Esa-Pekka Salonen, and so forth, have acquired international fame since the late 20th century. Finland joined the European Union in 1995 and continues to belong to it despite the fact that Britain will leave it in 2018 or 2019. A number of anti-EU Finns or Eurosceptic Finns have been demanding a referendum or direct vote by the Finnish adult citizens on continued membership in the European Union, but as long as the current Finnish political leadership is in power, it is unlikely that such a referendum will be held, because most members of the Finnish political elite want to stay in the European Union and are afraid that should a referendum be held, a majority of people possibly could vote no already out of their frustration and disappointment with and cynicism towards the Finnish political elite or establishment. Finland now has about 5.5 million people, heavily concentrated in southern and southwestern Finland and parts of western Finland, especially the metropolitan regions of Helsinki, Tampere, and Turku. Finland had its first female prime minister, Mrs. Anneli Jäätteenmäki of the Centre Party, briefly in 2003. She had to resign because of alleged corruption or crime in getting classified information about her predecessor, Social Democrat Paavo Lipponen's foreign policy regarding the US-Iraq conflict that erupted into the or escalated into the Second Persian Gulf War in 2003. Finland then has had one female prime minister, centrist Mari Kiviniemi, who was in office from 2010 to 2011. Finland's first female president, Social Democrat Tarja Halonen, served from 2000 to 2012. Finland attracts at least hundreds of thousands of foreign tourists, and then of course at least thousands or tens of thousands of Finnish expatriates each year. I myself visited Finland for about 6 weeks this April and May. The still fairly clean Finnish nature, the forests which still cover some 70% of Finland's land area, the tens of thousands, or according to one count, over 180,000 Finnish lakes and ponds, the so-called nightless night north of the Arctic Circle in midsummer, and on the other hand, the polar lights of midwinter when the northernmost Finland is under darkness officially. Many Finnish cultural sites, the hot steam of sauna, and such favorite Finnish foods as the Karelian pie and mammi and pea soup, pancakes, meatballs, pulla or sweet bread attract many people. Finland is a leading country in the internet access. Many Finns have at least some form of internet access. Many, if not most, Finns own a cell phone, while a dwindling number of Finns own a landline phone. And not only do many Finns own a cell phone, but many also own a smartphone. The new Finnish national school curriculum that was officially entered into force in August 2016 emphasizes the duty of Finnish teachers and other educators to encourage and enable their students to independently seek and evaluate information. And that is why many Finnish schools, especially in the bigger cities, have purchased more laptops and tablets to help people, to help these students to search information. Online learning is common in Finland. Adult education is also common, and even some senior citizens study part-time in order to remain mentally fresh and in order to have meaningful ways to pass their retirement. The Finnish social security system is still, by international comparisons, a fairly good one, with an officially universal or comprehensive health insurance, child allowance or family allowances, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, and fairly generous old age pensions, although it has gradually been cut back since the deep economic recession of the early 1990s. So overall, Finland has become a lot more modern, a lot more egalitarian, a lot more cosmopolitan, international, secular, and tolerant country during its 100 years of independence. Regarding religion, while still about 70% of Finns belong, or Finland's inhabitants belong, to the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church, only a few percent attend its services regularly. The Finnish Orthodox Church has slightly over 1% of the population belonging to it, and then smaller Christian communities and churches have a few percent either belonging to them or affiliated with them. A growing number of Finnish Christians seem to participate in the so-called cells or small groups and house churches or fellowships. There are also a number of international congregations and fellowships where quite many Christian immigrants and some Christian refugees assemble, especially in the major cities such as Helsinki, Espoo, Vantaa, and Tampere. Finland has a growing, although still fairly small, Muslim minority. As many as 5%, or perhaps even more, of Finns might either, or Finland's inhabitants might either belong to Muslim congregations or fellowships, or at least be affiliated with them. A notable, although still small, minority of Finnish women have converted to Islam because of their marriages to Muslim men. Finland tries to have officially good, or at least fairly good, relations with virtually all countries in the world. While Finland itself is firmly committed to democracy, it is cautious not to openly criticize those countries' political systems which it needs, for example, to have good relationships with for economic reasons. Finland is cautious regarding the authoritarian, semi-dictatorial political system in Russia, because it does not wish a deterioration of relations with Russia. One ongoing issue in Finland's foreign policy is its NATO membership. Since 1994, Finland and the Western neighbor Sweden have belonged to the so-called Partnership for Peace with NATO, which means that small groups of extremely well-trained military personnel go to international trouble spots, countries with ongoing war or recently ended war, and serve there in cooperation with NATO troops and United Nations troops as peacekeepers. So Finland is affiliated with the NATO but still lacks formal full membership in the alliance. However, Finland's northern neighbor Norway has been a founding member of NATO, and Finland's southern neighbor Estonia joined NATO, was it something like 10 years ago? Anyway, earlier this century. Finland belongs to this officially passport-free Schengen zone of European Union, but there have been moves to reintroduce some kind of passport control because of the ongoing, mostly Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, including Finland. So, in conclusion, I wish a very happy and blessed 100th anniversary of the Finnish independence, although that is still some 6 months away. Officially, Finland will turn 100 years as a declared independent country on December the 6th, 2017, and surely there will be a special Independence Day reception in Helsinki hosted by President Niinistö.